so thanks, guys, for having me here. When I am sat between David and Peter, I kind of feel like I need to introduce myself because who am I? So my name is Eddie Jacobs. I'm a researcher at the University of Oxford's Wellcome Centre for Ethics and Humanities, and I've just started a PhD in the Psychiatry Department there on the ethical implications of psychedelics. So when I was asked to give a presentation on the ethical implications of psychedelics, 20 minutes is not enough, 2 hours is not enough, 3 hours is not enough. There's just so much to choose from. Like a lot of topics just jump out at you. Lots have been discussed today. So issues about how can we respectfully and fairly engage with the indigenous cultures that have played steward to these medicines for so long, as in any situation where there are imbalances of powers. Sadly, and vulnerable people, sadly, there are issues of sexual assault that we need to kind of navigate. And likewise, issues of access. At the moment, this is a very resource-intensive modality of treatment. So we need to think about how we can make this available to as many people as possible, rather than having it be a preserve of the already privileged, wealthiest among us. So instead, what I wanted to talk to you about today was, well, motivating what might be of interest with psychedelics in medical ethics, i.e. what are the ethics of doctors giving people trips to treat their depression, for example. And the reason why I wanted to focus on this is because a lot of people, very possibly, sorry, the phone that is, I can hear my own voice and it's very distracting. When we talk about the medical ethics of psychedelic therapy, very possibly a lot of people in the audience today will think, why are you wasting 3 years on that? Because it's obvious, like it's obviously ethical. And the argument that I have heard goes a bit like this. This weekend, there will be thousands of people that take a tab of LSD or a fistful of mushrooms recreationally or for psycho-spiritual exploration. And even though that's not legal, you'd be hard-pressed to find an argument to say that that's ethically objectionable. And if it's ethically unobjectionable to do this recreationally, surely when there's a medical purpose, when there's a medical need being fulfilled, that must be ethical too. For example, because these safe compounds are even safer in medical contexts because there's proper screening going on. And if anything goes wrong, and things sometimes do go wrong with these drugs, at least you're surrounded by expert professionals and you have all the care that you need. So the reason why I wanted to focus on this is because, as David said in his last talk, the resistance to the expansion of psychedelics isn't necessarily going to be rational. There are going to be people who push back against this just because that's what they want. And also because maybe you buy the argument I just spun, ethical if recreational, therefore of course ethical if medical. But as is sometimes the case in these psychedelic conferences, there's a lot of preaching to the choir. There are going to be people who don't buy that at all, right? So in what follows, I'm not going to come at you with any musts or must-nots or shoulds or anything like that. I just want to build up a picture of some of the ethical terrain that's worthy of considering here, knowing that as we get closer to expansion and legitimization, there are going to be people that have questions about this sort of stuff. So it'll be good to know what their concerns might be. So first and foremost, why might there be a problem treating depression with any drug, let alone psilocybin? And to answer that, I think it's good to consider what the differences are between psychiatry as a medical discipline and any of the others, say orthopedic surgery or cardiology. And I think what sets psychiatry apart quite a bit is that with orthopedic surgery, with cardiology, with a host of other medical specialties, you can tend towards thinking about what you do in almost entirely mechanistic terms, like there is an object, there is a organ or organ system that you're seeking to fix. Among cardiologists, if your patient is at risk of blood clots, you can prescribe them warfarin to thin the blood. Likewise, if they have DVT, you prescribe your patient warfarin, and though there's lots of stuff below the bonnet that is being changed, nothing really happens to the person in terms of their qualitative experience day to day. How they interact with the people around them doesn't change. Say if you're a psychiatrist and you prescribe a patient SSRIs to treat their depression, you're no longer trying to fix an object so much. You're treating a subject, a person, with a qualitative experience. And this is part of the reason why lots of problems are thrown up for psychiatry, and you see a philosophy of psychiatry in the way that you don't see philosophy of cardiology or philosophy of orthopedic surgery. So if a psychiatrist is to prescribe a depressed patient with SSRIs and it works successfully, like what their goal is, involves changing their outlook, changing the qualitative experience of their life, changing the nature of the relationships they have with the world, the other people around them, and it changes how people experience them. Why is that an issue? So this was the subject of a lot of hand-wringing in the late 1980s, early 1990s, with the rise of SSRI antidepressants like Prozac. There was a concern that we were losing patients to Prozac and that this was cosmetic psychopharmacology. And the argument is spun a little bit like this. If you speak to a patient with depression for long enough and get a feel for them, one thing that comes up sooner or later is that their depression makes sense. Either their life situation currently is very distressing and quite unpleasant, or they've experienced some amount of trauma or distress in their past that they're carrying around, which makes them feel depressed. It might not be a good state of affairs, but we can track a meaningful link between their life situation and how they experience life, what their mood is, what their emotional range is. And suppose you successfully treat this patient with a 6-week course of SSRIs. Everything about that patient's personal history that was true before is still true. They're either in a distressing situation or have had trauma in their backstory and distressing things happened to them before. But now their mood has changed related to it. They could, if these drugs work really successfully, they could be quite positive despite the fact that everything around them is bad. And so there was a good number of psychiatrists and people running think pieces in the well-to-do magazine saying that this is a problem, this is inauthentic. To push that line as far as it will go, they would say, if you have a problem with soma in Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, if you have a problem with there being this drug that you just take and it makes you feel happy and content and calm, then you should have an issue with these SSRIs. Because what seems to be happening isn't engaging with the person, and a person is to some extent their history, it's just engaging with some part of their brain. They were drawing an analogy to Phineas Gage. So anyone that's done any neuroscience, and you're obliged in a lecture series to show a picture of Phineas Gage, a railroad worker who had the misfortune of having a railroad spike forced high speed up his left frontal lobe. And as a consequence, he became irascible, irritable, very impulsive. The argument is that SSRIs change people like a blow to the head or the destruction of your brain matter changes. It doesn't have any meaning. Whereas we change all through our life, but the sorts of non-medical changes that we say make sense are spun into the narrative of our stories. Like if someone goes off for 6 years to work in some missionary camp, or spends 6 years in a Zen monastery, or starts a family and starts raising children, and they change because of this, we say that those changes at least make sense because we can tie a sense-making story to the experience and what the changes of those outlets are. I'm not saying I'm by this, I'm saying this is what's in the air when you think about the philosophy of psychiatry. If you broadly accept this distinction of different ways that you can be changed, you have your slow-acting, experiential, slowly moulding of someone versus a fast-acting, clearly physiological change. You make an argument that one of those kinds is legitimate, authentic, and others aren't. Within that framework, where do psychedelics come? Really, it seems like they straddle between those two categories because, as David pointed out quite clearly, we know very well that they have specific actions on the brain. Also, they're very fast-acting. This is part of the reason why we're excited to develop them into medicines, is because they're extremely fast-acting. But then again, they're also hugely experiential. When you talk to people who've had psychedelic therapy and recovered from depression, they've made sense of it by relating to this experience. They will point to the insights they have while under the influence of the psilocybin. And they talk about the meaning that they've derived or the new ways that they are conceiving of their story. Like the participants will take that meaning and integrate it into their life story. So it seems to me, at least, that the experiential nature, the meaning, rescues authenticity, because even if these are acting on the brain, everything's acting on the brain, really. But even though these are acting on the brain, these are meaningful experiences. More than that, these are often the most meaningful experiences that patients have ever said. You know, the Johns Hopkins studies repeatedly find, if it's not the most meaningful experience of their life, it's in the top 5. And surely those are the sorts of experiences that we expect to change people, and that is authentic. Okay, so I would say that the experiential nature of psychedelics saves them from this charge of inauthenticity. But there's an argument that maybe we are out of the frying pan and into the fire, talking about the meaningfulness, the power of these experiences. I know it's bad form to just read off of a slide, but I wanted to share a quote with you. I'd never go back, even if I could. Life has meaning and a sense of purpose now that it never had before. I understand reality in a way I just couldn't before. It's amazing, but I can't really explain it to you. You have to go through it yourself to know what it's like. Now, I would wager that anyone here who has paid the ticket price and joined us for these talks, either they know someone who talks about their first ayahuasca experience like this, or they are someone who talks about their first ayahuasca experience like this. Even though these are the sorts of things we hear from people who have taken ayahuasca, these are also the sorts of things we hear about from new parents, right? Or to borrow a flippant example from the philosopher L.A. Poole, this is also the way we expect people who've just been turned into vampires to talk, right? Because what these experiences share, like sitting with Mother Ayahuasca for the first time, having and raising children, becoming a vampire, is that they are dramatically new, unknown experiences that change your life in really important ways. They are transformative. And I think there are 2 ways in which they're transformative. The first way is there's an epistemic transformation. Through these experiences, you come to learn information that you cannot learn or hope to learn any other way than by having that experience. And likewise, and crucially, they're personally transformative. As a result of them, what you often see is that the preferences, values, and priorities that we take to at least in part define us, change us, because of having had this experience. So the younger people in the crowd, if you consider the prospect of having kids, the prospect of parenthood, it may be the case that right now that isn't something you want, right? Because joyful as kids might be, becoming a parent now represents all sorts of foregone possibilities. It means no free evenings for 18 years. It means all sorts of things. But were you to become a parent in the next 9-12 months, there will be a whole host of hormonal and social pressures that slowly mold you to shape you into the sort of person that actually quite likes being a parent. Likewise, if you're given the offer to become a vampire, the prospect might not appeal to you, right? You really like sunbathing. The thought of drinking human blood to survive is off-putting. That may be the case. But if you were to become a vampire, like all of a sudden, you wouldn't be that interested in sunbathing and you'd be quite excited about the prospect of drinking blood. And so in a similar way, when you look at some of the persisting effects of psilocybin in some populations, there's lots of talk of shifts in values and behaviors. The persisting effects questionnaire that Johns Hopkins use a lot in their long-term studies includes questions like, my behavior is changed in ways I find positive, which is like all well and good, but the judgment of those behaviors changes, at least in part, according to the changes in values that come along with it. So I raised this whole issue of transformative experiences, not because I think transformative experiences per se are a problem, but rather that maybe transformative experiences make for uneasy bedfellows with medicine. Like, I think there's potential to iron this out, but I think it doesn't sit easily with the nature of informed consent. So both these types of transformations pose little challenges of their own. The first, the epistemic transformation, is linked to the fact that what we're trying to get at, or certainly what some labs are trying to get at when they give people psychedelic therapy, is a mystical experience. Because in all sorts of studies we've seen there's some of the variation of clinical benefit is tied to the extent of the mystical experience. But part of the way we know that there's been a mystical experience is because it's rated as ineffable. Literally that the boundaries of propositional language are insufficient to adequately express what this is like. And so it's pretty difficult to have informed consent to something that cannot be spoken of. I think we can massage that out okay, because to some greater or lesser extent, all experiences are novel. It's the personal transformation that I think is more challenging. And I think possibly the fact that these experiences, including psychedelic therapy, can change your values, mean that the choice of whether or not to go ahead with it, it seems like it has to be to some extent non-rational. Not that it's irrational, not that you know what the right thing to do is and you go the other way, but really that you are heavily epistemically blocked from making a meaningfully correct decision. Why do I say this? Because what do we do as a patient when we're looking to give informed consent for a procedure that we may or may not go ahead with? We judge the likelihood of success of the treatment, the risks associated with it, the costs, the side effects, the benefits. We'll like map out what's likely to happen if we do it, what's likely to happen if we don't do it. And then when we've got a fairly good idea of what the risks are for both sides, we choose the option that's most likely to improve our quality of life. That's what we want patients to do, come to an informed, considered, rational decision about what's going to improve their quality of life. But judgments about quality of life, as I've described above, before, they're dependent on values. And psychedelic experiences can change your values. So before you've had that psychedelic experience, you don't have access to what it's like to be a person with those values that you might have. Maybe we can smooth this out. There are a couple of options. I won't go into any detail on here. Another option is to bite the bullet and say, yeah, actually, we accept that there is some non-rationality involved, but that's okay to do in medical contexts. But of course, like, there are potentially unknown consequences of this once we start saying, okay, we'll accept non-rationality in some informed consent decisions. Okay, that's transformative experience. But now we get on to the really fun stuff. This is really new, uncharted territory, I think, to have doctors trying to induce mystical experiences, which really is what a lot of people are doing. And this is just at the borderlands between psychiatry and theology. And I think this is great. And psychedelic therapy is going to push forward a huge growth in research where we try and make sense of the connection between psychiatry and spirituality and God. So I borrow the title of this talk, of this slide, Medicalizing Mysticism, from Rachel Peterson, who is running a series of webinars of the same name at Harvard Divinity School. But before she joined Harvard, Rachel was a participant in, I think, JHU's psilocybin for depression trial. And afterwards, she wrote an article which you may recognize. She hated the title the sub-editor gave it, as I think everyone that writes psychedelic articles does. Her title was, I took psilocybin for depression and it cured my atheism. And of course, it's all a little bit more complicated than that, but we're approaching a very salient point there, which is traditionally the medical establishment holds a posture of maybe polite agnosticism towards spirituality and religion. Like, it doesn't really speak of those matters. Where we know that patients have specific spiritual beliefs, they're accommodated as much as possible. We are well aware that spiritual religious coping is seen in all sorts of conditions. The extent to which patients have a faith means they'll have improved outcomes because of resilience, and that's robust even when you account for the kind of social elements of spirituality and religion. Right, so I think now we've started using psilocybin, we need a new posture about what we think, what we, the medical establishment, think about this mysticism stuff. Because now we're kind of knowingly inducing these states, and it feels like a really big tool for us to be wielding. You may be familiar with some survey work Johns Hopkins did in the last year or so, which called for feedback from people who, under the influence of a psychedelic, either had a God encounter experience or a DMT entity, autonomous entity encounter. And so I take these two tables on the slide from the DMT encounter experience table. So a worthwhile caveat, the people responding to this weren't under clinical conditions, but they were presumably taking clinically relevant doses of these psychedelics. And I think it's extraordinary that of the people that had one of these encounters, 2/3 of them, once the DMT had worn off, once they were sober again, would attest to the fact that that experience was more real than their everyday waking consciousness. Like, so this has a huge power to influence people's metaphysical beliefs. And 2/3 of the people who had one of these experiences, who identified as atheists beforehand, rejected that label afterwards. Now, of course, this is not to say that psychedelics cure atheism in everyone, or that it's going to be how this plays out for everyone that takes these drugs, or even it might be a very small minority of people who take these drugs. There are plenty of people who smoke DMT have all the wonderful cosmic divine light show going on, and they look upon the face of God, and the boundaries between subject and object are shown to be an illusion that's shattered. They have all that, and the next day they're, funny thing my brain did yesterday, and that's that. But that's not the case for a lot of people. It's not necessarily that people will come out of these experiences saying, I believe in God, or I believe in angels, I believe in ultimate reality. But they will have like what's called ontological shock, this deep sense that, oh wow, I was quite wrong about some really quite fundamental things. And one of the challenges, I think, when you're forcing this set of questions on people to cure their tobacco addiction, is that when you start tugging at this thread of spirituality, of religion, of how the world really works, it doesn't really stop after 2 or maybe 3 integration sessions. This is something that's continually unfolding. Which kind of brings me to my final point, which is, as well as this transpersonal challenge that comes up, a lot of the personal material about your family, about early relationships, all of the narrative sense-making material that is seen afresh during a psychedelic experience, that's not sorted after your 2 integration sessions, after your 3 integration sessions. It's really important that you have those sessions to like take out the parts and talk them over and try and put them in some way that makes sense. But 6 months after, 12 months after, 18 months after, these issues continue to bubble up and percolate and elaborate themselves. Tessin Noorani, who's currently at Durham, invites us to think using the Greek concept of pharmakon. The ancient Greeks used the same word pharmakon for poison and cure, often at the same time. So the Greeks, when they had a headache, they didn't have any aspirin available, but they did have the bark of a willow tree, which incidentally is where aspirin comes from. But there was a trade-off involved, because you could take this willow tree to reduce your migraine, and kind of in return, you get some nausea. And possibly we can think about what happens for a lot of people with psychedelics is something like this. I'm not even sure if it's right to call it a side effect. Calling it a side effect is really diminishing the significance of it. To say that psilocybin, ayahuasca, DMT could take away your depression, but give you back kind of a riddle about your existence, or almost like a Zen koan, or something of a completely different kind for you to struggle with. So ayahuasca uses ceremonially. Will often talk about being given homework that they have to get, like even if they're not seeking some clinical resolution of a medical condition, they've got a challenge that they need to make sense of. And it seems that potentially this sort of stuff falls off what we look for in clinical trials, just by virtue of the fact that we're measuring outcomes against clinically validated scales. But so Rachel Peterson, after her depression returned, after her trial, said that the depression wasn't any smaller than it was before, but the space around it got bigger. And so that's the sort of, yeah.
I'm just going to give you, sorry, just 1 or 2 more minutes. I know you're nearly done.
Yeah, no, this is my last slide.
Amazing.
So yeah, thank you. So where do we understand things like that? Because it's not neatly put into our clinical instruments at all. So I think we have to be wary of miscommunication. Like, I know I've done it in the past, like in writing, and I regret it a little bit. You can quite easily say 2 sessions with psilocybin cures depression, which I think simplifies that a lot. It's not a coincidence that where there are these clinical trial research centres, integration groups come up too. This is because the therapists recognise that there's a need for ongoing support. And that's really, I think, the main policy challenge that I want to be focusing on, is how do we make sure that these integration groups happen? Who is going to be resourcing them? Who is going to be paying for them? Tim Leary did one study with the original Harvard psilocybin project, trying to reduce recidivism rates among prisoners, and gave half of the group psilocybin experience. They had all the wonderful stuff happened, but when the final statistical analysis came through, it didn't really make much of a difference. And that's because Leary's outfit didn't have the resources to support these people when they went back out onto the streets. And having this wonderful experience isn't enough. You need more than just a couple of integration sessions. You need to hold everything for a longer time to help integrate back into the world. All right, Anna, there you go. That's me.